Russia can't afford a further drop in its oil revenues, which have gone down significantly this year. And if you think about it, the European Union has dropped the cap on Russian oil prices from $60 to $45 per barrel. Other countries are following. If the U.S. followed that as well, that's another shock to Moscow. So yes, I think everything that you talk about is part of this broad picture. But I think the immediate challenge for the Kremlin was, don't let those sanctions get toughened. Because remember, it's not just Trump's threat of sanctions. 85 of 100 U.S. senators have threatened sanctions of up to 500% on Russia and its partners. And the U.S. Congress comes back from vacation at the start of September.
Also, do you expect any kind of at least a limited ceasefire deal? From your perspective, what has Vladimir Putin promised to Steve Witkoff in Moscow, and what was the reason why Trump decided to meet in person, or Putin decided to meet in person? And my second question is, who was the first leader to propose in-person meeting?
The Kremlin proposed the meeting. I mean, if you work this through, what happened here is that the Kremlin invite Donald Trump's envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, to Moscow. And he goes to Moscow a few days ago, right? And the Kremlin confirms to Witkoff, we would like to have this meeting take place. That's the way that this was played. Now, what is interesting is you say, well, what did Russia offer? What type of compromise did it offer? And if you think about it, they didn't offer a single compromise. Instead, think about all the discussion, and there's a little bit of tension and contradiction here, but they have not offered to give up any of the territory that they occupy at this point. They have not offered a ceasefire at this point. They have not offered even to stop the attacks on civilian areas at this point. There was one flutter that we had when the envoy Stephen Witkoff came back, where he reportedly told Trump, oh, if you give Russia all of the territory in the east, the Donbass, then they will withdraw from Kherson and Zaporizhia. That was wrong. He either misunderstood it or he just simply was what we call clueless about what was happening. The Russians never offered to withdraw from Kherson and Zaporizhia, from the occupied areas, and they made that very clear. So no, what is interesting here is that we're not talking about a negotiation. We're talking about Russia restating its demands while having Trump in the room. Now, what does Trump get out of it by getting there? He gets the photo opportunity. And he gets the idea, and the Kremlin will give him the idea that if he repeats their demands, this will be a great peace deal. Now, can they persuade him of that? Or are there good enough American advisors, Trump administration advisors, who are there in Alaska, who will warn Trump, you're playing into the Kremlin's hands if you do this? That's a key question. So look, not only about Trump going to Alaska, see who the other advisors are. Are they the pro-Kremlin advisors like Steve Witkoff? Are they those who tend to back Kyiv, at least to the idea of that it should be defended, such as Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine? Is it the Vice President J.D. Vance, who has been very hostile to Ukraine in the past, but who may be shifting position because he's been lobbied by Kyiv and by Europe very, very significantly in the last few days, including a meeting near London last weekend?
From your perspective, could Vladimir Putin offer Trump this limited ceasefire in the air and present this as a large concession to Trump and large progress as a result of this meeting? And don't you think that this type of so-called concession could allow Vladimir Putin to continue instead a ground war on the ground for several months?
I certainly think Putin could do that. And speaking personally, I don't advise the Kremlin. I don't think they would listen to me, but will. I've thought, going all the way back to February, during the initial U.S.-Russia direct talks, if you remember those, where they excluded Ukraine, they excluded Europe. I did not understand why Russia did not pull back on the missile and drone attacks. I simply don't understand why they did not. But the reality is, when they were talking to the Americans in February, they did not pull back on the attacks. And that eventually meant that Ukraine and Europe had the space to get back into the discussions. If you think about it, when we had the discussions between Ukraine and Russia in Turkey in the late spring, the day after those discussions, Russia was launching missile and drone attacks, including deadly attacks on Kyiv. And so once again, they threw away the advantage that they could look like they really wanted to make peace. So yeah, I think it's an absolute logical step for Putin to offer a halt to aerial attacks by both sides, by Ukraine and by Russia. But for some reason, he hasn't offered that before. And that remains a big question mark in my mind as to whether he will do it again on Friday, whether he would finally do this on Friday.
What are the risks that there would be no any kind of progress as a result of this meeting? And do you think that Trump fears lack of progress, or he just doesn't care about it?
I think Trump will be frustrated if there's no sign of progress, at least in a symbolic sense. He'll want to stand alongside Putin, and he'll want to get flattered, right? But that's the risk. The flattery may be enough for Trump. He may not need a significant Russian concession, even a halt to the aerial attacks, as long as he gets to stand there and smile and Vladimir pats him on the back. Think all the way back to the summit in Helsinki in 2018, before Trump blackmailed Ukraine the first time, when we were talking about Russia having supported Trump's 2016 campaign, how Russia had said, your intelligence agencies are terrible. Trump took Vladimir Putin's side. And you might remember the photographs from Helsinki with Putin smiling, because they'd gotten Trump into that space where he just wanted the limelight. He wanted the cameras on him. That's why I'm cautious we'll have any type of meaningful progress. Certainly any type of compromise that comes out of it. I don't think we'll get that. But I think that then returns us to the question of where Ukraine and Europe and the international community come back in. Because if there's no progress after this, Ukraine and Europe come back in and they restate, here's our proposal for the 30-day ceasefire. Here's our proposal for an agreement which will end this invasion. They will go to people in Washington, within Trump's administration, but also in Congress, and say, we're the adults in the room. We're the people that you can deal with. And that space may open up again this autumn for politically and diplomatically Ukraine and Europe to get the advantage. And that would be a type of progress. It just won't be the headline progress coming out of Alaska on Friday.
Could US President Donald Trump also visit Russia? Because there are some rumors about that, and about the possibility Trump visiting Russia with Vladimir Putin after this summit in Alaska.
Well, certainly he would like to go to Russia. I mean, I'm sure that you and your viewers noticed in his talking to journalists this week where he slipped up and he said, oh, I'm looking forward to seeing Vladimir Putin in Russia, when he meant Alaska. And I think, again, this may be the Kremlin's play here, which is, oh, we've had a great meeting here, but we need to continue the discussion. We need to continue this. So without agreeing to a ceasefire, without agreeing to any concessions, they arranged to have follow-up meetings, probably initially between senior officials. Say, for example, Sergei Lavrov, possibly with the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, possibly by hosting Witkoff again. And of course, what they do is, by saying we have those follow-up meetings, is they keep pushing back the idea of toughened U.S. sanctions. They just keep giving themselves some space from that threat.
Also, I would like to cover with you the possible role of President Zelensky during this summit. It seems like President Zelensky has not yet been invited to this meeting. What is your reaction to this? And could there will be another meeting between Trump and Zelensky after the summit?
I think there was a flutter, on this headline issue that maybe Zelensky would also go to Alaska. Certainly there was at least one official in the Trump administration that said that was a possibility, and then J.D. Vance said it was a possibility. I think it might have been their idea not to look too much like they were in the Kremlin's pocket, why they said that. But you and I know that was never realistic. Because Vladimir Putin doesn't recognize Vladimir Zelensky as a legitimate head of state or head of government. So Putin wasn't going to negotiate with Zelensky there. He wasn't even going to negotiate indirectly with him. The only reason why Zelensky would have gone there would be for Putin and Trump to hand him an ultimatum. Here you go, sign this. And there's no way Zelensky was going to do that. So no, I don't think that's the big story. I think the big story has been that Zelensky and European partners have been preparing all week. In fact, they've been preparing for weeks because they knew this might happen. And where are we with those preparations? Zelensky and Europe are emphasizing that a ceasefire is the first priority, and that you cease fire, and then you can talk about what we do about the situation on the front lines, what you do in terms of the economic position, what you do about the military position, what you do about Ukraine's relationship with the EU. We can discuss all of that, but first you cease fire. Secondly, they have made it very clear, Zelensky and the Europeans, that the onus is on the Russians to stop their attacks. It's not, this isn't a case that both sides are to blame here. It's the Russians who have been the aggressors. So I think they've done this very well. And they've done this by trying to keep Trump from going all the way into the Kremlin's pocket. So last weekend, what do? J.D. Vance talks to the British Foreign Secretary in England, near London. The British Foreign Secretary then meets with 6 European heads of state on the Saturday to talk about where their tactics are going to be. Now, where are we? We have 9 European leaders, 6 heads of state, the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Council, Antonio Costa, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. They and Vladimir Zelensky will talk to Donald Trump by phone on Wednesday. And they'll try to draw these lines again with Trump. Get a ceasefire. We value what you do, Mr. Trump. You're a peacemaker. Get that ceasefire. They'll try to keep the initiative with him rather than giving way where he can be manipulated by Putin.
Can they really convince Trump to adopt, to support common position of European countries and the US on ending this war?
We don't know. And I think the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk yesterday said something very interesting. He said we have both hopes and concerns for this meeting on Friday because Donald Trump is unpredictable. And he's absolutely right. I mean, let's state a couple of fundamentals here. Donald Trump knows very little about what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, very little about it. He knows very little about the battlefield situation. He knows very little about the territorial situation. That's why he's been saying silly things like, oh, I'm going to get a territorial swap, when that's not what we're talking about here. He actually has very little details on the economic situation. The only thing Donald Trump really knows is on a personal level, what he sees or what he feels. And the advantage that Ukraine and Europe have had in the recent weeks is what he sees and what he feels is Russia not giving him that Nobel Peace Prize, that opportunity for the Nobel Peace Prize, because they haven't been stopping the attacks. And what he feels is when his wife Melania came and told him the day after Russia had talked to Ukraine that you'd had these attacks on Kyiv and the nursing home had been struck. Trump repeats that story quite often. So, in terms of Donald Trump quite often says what the last person in the room says to him. And so far, Ukraine and Europe, along with Trump advisors, have been able to keep in his ear, to keep him from going all the way to side with the Kremlin. But on Friday, Vladimir Putin has got him for that day. And we don't know which other advisors are going to be in the room. Remember, Trump has even met Putin one-on-one without even having his own translator in the room in the past. So, that unpredictability of Trump means that I would hope Ukraine and Europe can keep him from repeating Vladimir Putin's demands at that press conference on Friday, but you can't guarantee that will happen.
Also, there have been some discussions and publications about the possibility of swapping land between Ukraine and Russia. What are the chances for that? We know about the Vladimir Putin's demand, but how could the not the best case, but the normal case scenario of this look like for Ukraine?
There's zero chance of swapping land. I mean, that's a story that came out of a mistaken report by Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, when he came back from Moscow. He went and he told Trump, said, okay, if the Russians get more territory in the Donbass, then they will withdraw from Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. The Russians never told him that. I mean, that was just wrong. But before we could find that out, Donald Trump was saying swapping of territory. So no, we're not talking about swapping of territory. I mean, Ukraine tried to take part of the Kursk region in Russia so that it might have leverage for that type of swap in negotiations. But unfortunately, they couldn't hold on to that territory in Kursk, except for a small sliver on the border. So no, we're not talking about a territorial swap. We're talking about how much land Russia demands from Ukraine and how much Donald Trump supports those demands. That's the fundamental on Friday.
Could these negotiations lead to a full ceasefire deal in the long-term prospect? Because you also mentioned during our conversations that Russia cannot sustain this war for more than 6-12 months ahead. Do you feel that these negotiations could lead to a full ceasefire this year or next year?
If I may speak honestly to all my great friends in Ukraine, you all have been so brave and you've endured so much. And I'm afraid it will continue for some time. You know, this meeting on Friday will not lead to a full ceasefire. I don't even think it'll lead to a partial ceasefire, as much as I hope so. Russia will restate their demands. They will try to get Donald Trump to support those demands. It's going to be incumbent with you being in the forefront that you maintain your resistance, that you maintain the fight for your nation, your state, because we'll have to go through more months of this. Now, I do think there will be a time when Russia will be under pressure to finally halt the military operations because of its economic situation, but I think that is probably going into next year. I also think there is a potential landing point for a short-term halt to the invasion, and it will require a sacrifice on the part of Ukraine. And I think the Zilinsky government is considering this, and that is that there'll have to be an acceptance in the short term of the Russian occupation of the land that they hold now. Crimea, parts of the south, parts of the east. The battle lines, in effect, will be frozen as you get that ceasefire. And then the rest of Ukraine will have a path to European Union membership, probably not to NATO membership, but to an association with NATO and to security guarantees from the West. I've used this analogy before. I think, unfortunately, the full liberation of Ukraine is not what I envisage, but it's a position similar to West Germany and East Germany during the Cold War, that people in Germany had to accept the loss of part of their territory to the Soviet bloc, but in return, the rest of Germany, West Germany, prospered. It prospered by joining, in fact, by being one of the founders of the European Economic Community, which later became the EU, by becoming one of the members of NATO, and by becoming one of the leading states in Europe. And that, I think, for me, is the best case scenario for Ukraine, but it's one that I don't think comes into play for another few months at the least.